I think a couple of decades ago, many people assumed certain countries as perfect places for people to live. Places like Canada and countries in Northern Europe, where as long as you put in the right effort, things are very well taken care of. You have safe streets, you have functional cities, universal healthcare, and you have strong welfare. And it looked orderly, it looked predictable, and it looked very stable. And it is a tendency among us to assume stability as permanent, and once a country reaches a certain level, it stays there. That assumption, historically, has been very wrong. What looks like niceness is usually the result of systems working under the right conditions. And when those conditions change, the results change as well. And Canada shows signs of this very clearly. The core issue here is demographics. Canada's fertility rate is about 1.3 children per woman. You'll often hear that 2.1 is the replacement rate. That number has a very specific meaning. Replacement does not mean growth. It means each generation is large enough to replace itself. And it's 2.1 because 2 children replace the parents, and the extra 0.1 accounts for people who never have children and for mortality before adulthood. When fertility is below 2.1, the population does not collapse immediately. Instead, each generation becomes smaller than the one before it. That matters because modern states don't just need people, they need enough people in the right age range. That gap doesn't sound dramatic, but in welfare states, it can be brutal. A shrinking population by itself isn't always a problem. A shrinking working age population is. Canada's welfare systems is financed largely on a pay-as-you-go basis. Current workers fund current pensions, they fund the healthcare, and they fund most public services. When fewer people enter the workforce, two things happen at once. First, the tax base grows slowly or shrinks. And secondly, the number of people relying on public spending increases, and that creates ongoing pressure. Now, not exactly a single breaking point, but repeated budget constraints and trade-offs. In the 1970s, Canada had about 7 workers for every retiree. That ratio made the system very effective and very easy to function along. Pension costs were spread across several contributors, and healthcare costs were lower because the population was younger. And government had enough fiscal room for more expansion. And today, the ratio is closer to 3 workers per retiree. And by 2030s, it's likely that the number will be near 2 to 1. And at that level, each worker supports a larger share of pension cost. Healthcare spending rises because the population is older, and governments have less flexibility to invest anywhere else. And this is why aging populations create long-term fiscal pressure even in developed countries. Healthcare is where the stress shows first. Healthcare is the clearest example because in Canada, healthcare already accounts for around 40% of provincial spending. So older populations use more healthcare. They require longer treatments, and at the same time, the number of new workers paying into the system is not really keeping up with pace, and that result is visible. You have longer wait times, there's difficulty finding primary care. This is not a sudden failure. This is a system adjusting to its demographic changes in a very limited amount of time with very limited options. So faced with low birth rates, Canada chose the fastest available solution, which is immigration, because waiting decades for fertility to recover was really not a viable option. So Canada increased intake very, very sharply. In 2022 and 2023, Canada added 430,000 permanent residents per year, plus large number of people who are temporary workers as well as students. Relative to population size, this was one of the fastest growth rates in developed world. The immediate effects were measurable. So population growth accelerated, labor shortages went down in certain sectors, and the average age of population also declined slightly. But then population growth does not automatically solve all problems, and it doesn't automatically create capacity. There were very visible side effects. Housing took the first hit. Between 2015 and 2023, Canada added roughly 3.5 million people, but only built around 1.8 million housing units. This gap explains much of the inequality here. So prices and rents rose up because of high demand increases faster than the supply. And cities like Toronto and Vancouver, home ownership moved further out of reach from young adults. Rent consumed a large share of people's income. That also fed back to demographics as younger people delayed forming families in general. Housing wasn't the only area that was affected. Public services expanded slowly compared to population growth. Hospitals became more crowded. The transit systems ran close to capacity, and schools faced enrollment pressure in fast-growing areas. In the labor market, some sectors benefited from a steady supply of workers, but the wage growth slowed in some areas as well that were dependent on temporary labor. So immigration addressed workforce numbers, but it did not really automatically expand infrastructure and services at the same pace. So there is a policy dilemma that Canada now faces, and it has constrained choices. If immigration remains high, housing shortages will persist, and infrastructure and services will struggle to keep up. And if immigration slows down significantly, then workforce growth will weaken and fiscal pressures will be all-time high. Other options exist, but they're politically very difficult. They might include things like raising retirement ages, increasing taxes, or reducing benefits. Now, once again, something that the public would really not want, and there would be enormous public backlash. On the other hand, encouraging higher birth rates helps only over the long period of time, and financial incentives alone have shown very limited impact. So what does this mean moving forward? I think, and this is a popular guess, Canada will continue with multiple approaches, which is ongoing immigration, gradual adjustments to welfare programs, and selective family support policies. Now, the outcome depends less on any single policy and more on whether housing, infrastructure, and services expand fast enough to match population growth. But there is a broader lesson here that Canada isn't unique. Many developed countries face the same demographic pressures: low fertility rate, aging population, and welfare systems designed for different age structures. The good life here depends on conditions that have to be maintained. When population structure changes, systems have to change with it. If they don't, stress accumulates. That's not a moral failure or a political slogan. It's the result of demographic and economic constraints. And I guess we'll just wait and see how it goes.